After years of silence, Jasmine Crockett risked everything to reveal a Vatican secret buried across generations, a secret personally entrusted to her by Pope Francis. Over 50 million people watched live as she opened a letter that could destroy an entire empire. Betrayal, fear, and an unstoppable wave of truth. This was not just history unfolding. It was a reckoning waiting for centuries. But what hidden forces will rise to crush her before the light can break through? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio lights blazed in brilliant blue and white, casting long shadows across the black lacquer of the stage while the audience buzzed, restless and expectant. The kind of excitement only late-night television could conjure. 1,000 grins, half expecting another predictable evening of laughs and gossip. The MC, polished and eager, stepped into the spotlight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the most influential political figures of our time, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Applause erupted, scripted, automatic, a tidal wave of claps designed to sweep the night along. But then the curtains parted and the room exhaled all at once. Jasmine stepped onto the stage, not with the buoyant stride of a media darling, but with a slow, deliberate weight, like a soldier returning from a battle no one else had fought. Her face was set, the corners of her mouth unmoving, her eyes burning with something far heavier than political ambition. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. She moved with the gravity of someone carrying a truth too large for one lifetime. The MC extended his hand brightly, but Jasmine barely brushed it, her fingers cold and brief in the handshake. She moved to the guest chair with mechanical precision, every step a drum beat of quiet defiance against the empty cheer around her. The audience, sensing something off, faltered, the applause petering out into an uneasy murmur. The cameras kept rolling. The lights stayed fixed, but the energy in the room fractured as if everyone realized all at once that tonight would not unfold as expected. Jasmine sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, and then the spotlight caught something no one had noticed before. A small golden rosary resting on the table between her and the MC. It hadn't been there a moment ago. No one remembered seeing anyone place it. It gleamed against the dark wood like a silent witness, humming with a tension that made the very air seem brittle. And as Jasmine's eyes fell on it, something deep inside her seemed to lock into place, as if the entire night had been waiting for that single fateful second. And just like that, the atmosphere cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but in the way a dam groans before it gives way. The MC, still clinging to the routine, gave a tight laugh, bouncing slightly in his chair, tapping the cards against his knee like a man trying to restart a dead engine. "So, Jasmine," he said brightly, voice slicing the air like a butter knife against concrete, "you're everywhere these days, making headlines, winning debates, America's new favorite powerhouse. Tell us, how do you juggle it all?" He winked playfully at the audience, coaxing them into a laugh that came a second too late, too thin, like the sputter of a car running out of gas. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her gaze was locked on the golden rosary on the table. Motionless, heavy, like a judge contemplating a verdict no one wanted to hear, the camera stayed trained on her face, hoping for a smile, a wink, a witty retort, but nothing came. Only the long, unbearable silence of a woman measuring a choice so heavy it bent the air around her. The MC shifted in his seat, forcing a chuckle that sounded more like a cough. "Maybe you've got a book deal coming. A podcast. Everyone's doing podcasts these days." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and a few polite chuckles stumbled from the audience, unsure if they were supposed to find this funny or terrifying. Still Jasmine said nothing. Still she stared at the rosary. Still the pressure built, invisible but crushing like the air just before a storm when the birds fall silent. The MC swallowed, wiping his hands subtly against his pant leg. He tried again, softer this time, desperate. "Jasmine, you okay?" His smile was faltering now, slipping into something smaller, something scared. And that's when Jasmine moved slowly, deliberately. She lifted her eyes from the table. Her head rose, not fast, not dramatic, just a single movement, clean and precise, like the drawing of a sword from a scabbard. Her gaze found the MC, but it wasn't him she was really seeing. It was something beyond him, something none of them could understand yet. Something coming. The room tensed on instinct. The laughter died entirely, as if every lung had forgotten how to breathe. And then she spoke, her voice low, rough-edged, carrying the raw gravity of a truth too long imprisoned. "I can't keep pretending anymore." The words struck like a blade into the heart of the set. The MC froze, mouth half open, a joke dying unfinished on his lips. The audience froze. Every movement, every whisper, every fidget falling into stunned stillness. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her hands curling into tight fists atop her knees. The golden rosary caught the light and burned between them like a fuse about to reach the powder. Her next words came quieter, but somehow heavier, sinking straight into the bone. "Tonight, there's something I have to say. No music, no applause, no polite segue to commercial. Only the terrible yawning silence of a room realizing that it had stumbled by accident or fate into history." The silence inside the studio stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Jasmine sat forward slightly, her hands curled into each other on her lap, breathing steady like someone lowering herself into deep, dangerous waters. She spoke again, but her voice had changed. It was softer, yes, but it carried a pressure now, like a tide building far below the surface. It was years ago, her eyes unfocused, speaking almost to herself. "I had been moving from country to country, buried in endless reports, meetings that blurred into more meetings. Europe was supposed to be another stop, another faceless crowd, another speech no one would remember." She paused, her brow tightening, memory flickering like a flame behind her eyes. But that night the world tilted. The audience leaned forward instinctively, as if the very air between them and her might break if they moved too fast. "I was staying in Florence," Jasmine continued, her hands now clasped tightly enough that her knuckles whitened. "An old hotel, beautiful in the way that only old sorrow can be beautiful. Stone walls, heavy wooden doors that swallowed sound. I remember the windows rattling slightly in the winter wind that night. She swallowed once hard. Around midnight, someone knocked on my door, just once, software, but it felt like it hit straight through me." Her hand moved unconsciously to her chest, as if remembering the sensation even now. I waited for a voice, a second knock, anything, but there was only silence. The studio audience barely breathed. Even the studio lights seemed dimmer somehow, like the story itself was eating the brightness out of the room. When I opened the door, Jasmine said, her voice almost a whisper. The hallway was empty. No footsteps, no sound, only an envelope lying flat against the floor. Thick paper, heavy, hand-pressed. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, reliving the chill that had rippled down her spine that night. There was no name, no address, nothing except one thing, the seal, blood-red wax stamped with a crest so old it looked like it belonged to another century. Her voice caught slightly before she forced it steady again. It was the Vatican's crest, another beat past thick enough to feel. "I told myself it was a mistake," she said, her lips tightening against the memory. "Some letter meant for someone else. Some prank by a drunk tourist. I told myself not to open it." Her eyes opened then, sharp and burning, dragging the audience deeper into her gravity, but something inside me, something deeper than fear or logic, whispered that I had to. She opened her palm slowly, miming the act of breaking the seal, her fingers trembling just enough for everyone to see it. And when I did, she said, voice hollow, Inside there was no letter, no introduction, no instructions, only one sentence, handwritten in black ink, so faint it looked like it might vanish if you stared at it too long. She leaned closer, and when she spoke the words, it felt as if the entire studio contracted inward. Walk with me under the olive trees, no cameras, no press. The phrase hung in the air, simple, haunting, impossibly heavy. For a full minute, Jasmine continued, a bitter smile flickering across her face. I stood there just staring at it, trying to convince myself it was nonsense, that I could crumple it up and forget it ever touched my hands. She paused, voice fraying at the edges, raw and human. But some things, she said, some things call you in a way you don't understand. Some truths choose you before you even realize you're part of them. She looked straight into the camera, then into the heart of everyone watching, and said, and that night I understood one thing more clearly than I ever had in my life. She let the silence thicken, sharpen, crush the space between them before finishing, her voice barely more than a breath. I had to go. And so I went, Jasmine thought, her voice threading low across the frozen silence of the studio. And from the first step I took that night, I knew I was leaving something behind forever. The streets of Vatican City were unnaturally quiet, their marble bones cold under her shoes as she moved deeper into a maze of corridors few outsiders ever walked. The air smelled of old stone and something else, something older, something like memory. At every turn, the towering walls seemed to press inward, as if trying to swallow her whole before she reached her destination. Jasmine didn't hesitate, not because she wasn't afraid, but because some fears are smaller than the terror of living a life spent looking away. She followed the directions given, each hallway more narrow, more deserted than the last, until finally a narrow archway yawned open, spilling her into a garden that felt untouched by time itself. It was colder here. The olive trees stood gnarled and skeletal, their roots knotted through the cracked earth like the fingers of the dead. Moonlight spilled in thin sheets across the garden, outlining every twisted branch in silver. The shadows were so deep they seemed almost alive, breathing, moving just at the edge of sight. Jasmine's breath formed small ghostly clouds in the frozen air as she walked forward, her steps crunching softly against gravel, so old it might have once paved the feet of saints. And there he was. Pope Francis stood beneath the largest olive tree, folds of his simple white robe almost swallowed by the night. He did not wear the gold, the jewels, the ornaments of his station, only the plain garments of a man who had nothing left to hide. His shoulders hunched forward slightly, as if the weight of unseen wars bowed him lower with every breath. His frame was thinner than the photographs, more fragile, and yet the light that burned in his eyes was impossibly fierce, refusing to dim against the vast, indifferent dark around them. He watched Jasmine approach without speaking, without moving, like a sentinel waiting at the edge of a battlefield already lost. Jasmine slowed, her own body stiffening against the cold, against the enormity of what was about to happen. There was no fanfare, no procession, no words of welcome, only the deep thrum of silence heavy enough to crush lesser souls. When she finally stopped a few feet from him, the stillness between them grew so dense it felt physical, a wall of unsaid things that could suffocate if touched too carelessly. Pope Francis looked at her, and for a long moment he said nothing. He only stared into her, not at her, his gaze peeling back every layer of pretense, every shield, until all that was left was the raw, naked reality of two people meeting across a chasm that could not be crossed by titles or rituals. His face, lined and worn, was a map of a lifetime spent fighting storms the world never saw. Then finally his voice came, low, cracked, human. I have failed. The words didn't ring out. They didn't demand. They simply fell like stones slipping from the hands of a man too tired to hold them any more. I have failed to protect the faith, he continued, his hands hanging limp at his sides, from those who twist it, from those who trade it for gold and power. He shook his head slowly, the sorrow in him so vast it seemed to warp the air itself. There are wolves among us, wolves who wear the skin of angels, and they have turned the house of God into a marketplace. The olive branches overhead rustled in a wind that felt colder than death. But neither Jasmine nor Pope Francis moved because some truths were too heavy to outrun. The weight of his confession still burned in the cold air between them, and Jasmine realized then, with terrible clarity, that the truth wasn't just meant to be spoken. It was meant to be passed on, carried forward, by those brave enough not to look away. Slowly, painfully, Pope Francis shifted his hands within the folds of his simple robe. His fingers, thin and vain like the roots of an ancient tree, searched for something hidden deep against his chest, something precious enough to guard with his final strength. Jasmine watched, unable to move, as he withdrew a single envelope, thick, heavy, the color of old parchment, aged by hands that had held too much sorrow. Its seal, a deep crimson disk of wax, bore the Vatican's ancient insignia, pressed with a finality that made it look almost like a wound. He cupped the envelope in both palms for a moment, staring down at it as if saying good-bye to something he had fought to protect longer than anyone would ever know. Then slowly he extended it toward her. The gesture was small, almost trembling, but it felt like the entire garden tilted around it, as if the earth itself leaned closer to witness the moment. Jasmine reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his. The envelope was cold, colder than the night air, and heavier than its size should allow, as if inside it lived not just words, but the ruins of battles fought and lost behind marble walls. Her hand closed around it carefully, reverently, like a soldier accepting orders she knew might one day cost her everything. And for a long moment, Pope Francis simply looked at her, into her, with an intensity so raw it made her heart clench painfully inside her chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was not that of a pope addressing the world. It was the voice of an old man, tired, bruised by wars fought in silence, pleading not for himself, but for something far greater. If I do not have the chance, you must be the one to open the truth. The words didn't shout. They didn't echo. They sank. They embedded themselves into Jasmine's spine, her lungs, her bloodstream, branding her with a duty she hadn't asked for, but could no longer refuse. She clutched the envelope tighter against her chest, feeling the cold seep into her skin, feeling the enormity of what it meant seep into her soul. Around them the olive trees swayed and groaned under the winter wind, their old limbs scratching against each other like ancient bones, mourning things too old to name. Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, to promise him something, anything, but no words came. Some silences are too sacred for words. The envelope still weighed heavily in Jasmine's hand, but what truly anchored her in place was the realization dawning quietly, relentlessly inside her. She had not been chosen by chance. She had been chosen because there was no one else left. Pope Francis's eyes didn't waver, even as the cold night drew tighter around them. His voice was thin but sharp, cutting through the silence like a whispered sword. I could not give this burden to those closest to me, he said, and there was no anger in his tone, only a hollow, exhausted grief. They have built walls around themselves so thick with pride, fear, and ambition that no truth can pass through them any more. They dress in silk and gold. They speak of the poor, but dine with kings. Their prayers are loud, but their hearts are quiet when they should be screaming. His hands folded before him trembled, not from weakness, but from the unbearable knowledge of betrayal. Jasmine swallowed, her throat dry and raw, the reality of his words hitting her harder than the winter wind. I needed someone untouched by these walls, he continued, his voice dropping lower, almost conspiratorial, as if the shadows themselves were listening. Someone who has not been fed by the system, someone they would underestimate, dismiss, never see coming. He let the words settle between them like stones sinking into deep water. You are that someone. The weight of his gaze pinned her to the ground more surely than any chain ever could. You are not bound by their false oaths. You are not poisoned by their crowns. His voice cracked then, only once. The break so small most would miss it. But Jasmine heard it. felt it like a fissure running through the night, and that, he finished, almost whispering now, is why you can do what none of them will. The garden seemed to press closer around them, as if the very stones and trees bore witness to the passing of something sacred, something irreversible. And in that frozen breath of time, Jasmine understood. She was no longer merely a visitor. She was a weapon, and the truth she now carried was sharp enough to cut through even the thickest walls of silence. But the truth was never meant to sit quietly, and neither, it seemed, were those determined to bury it before she ever found the courage to set it free. The night she walked away from that hidden Vatican garden, Jasmine thought the hardest part was over. She was wrong. In the days that followed, she wrapped the envelope in a layer of old legal files, slid it into a false bottom drawer, and told herself it could wait. She buried it the way some bury grief. Quietly, methodically, without ever quite believing it would stay buried. She told herself she was being rational, that whatever was inside could not be more important than the life she had built, the safety she had earned. But the envelope never stopped breathing under the surface of her days. She could feel it sometimes at night through the walls of her apartment, a faint pulse, like something alive scratching from inside a coffin. She had not broken the seal, but somehow the world already knew she carried it, and the world had begun to react. The changes came slowly at first, little things small enough to ignore. A locked laptop, left untouched overnight, flickered with ghost emails by morning. Conversations on secured phone lines crackled with static, dropping into dead air whenever she said words like Rome or Vatican. Once at a crowded cafe, she caught the glint of a camera lens behind a newspaper aimed straight at her chest. And though she told herself it was nothing, she began to notice other patterns. The same black car idling at the curb for hours. A face she recognized from the courthouse hallway suddenly appearing at her gym, her grocery store, her church. Paranoia, she whispered to herself, only paranoia until the first letter arrived. It was tucked between her electricity bill and a flyer for a pizza shop that had been closed for 6 months. No stamp, no handwriting, just a single sheet of paper typed in cold, clinical font. Silence protects more than you know. Jasmine stared at the words until they blurred, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that left her dizzy. She told no one. She shredded the letter and burned the shreds in her kitchen sink, watching the flames eat the warning letter by letter. But 2 weeks later, another came, and then another and another. The letters never changed, the message never softened. Silence protects more than you know, but it wasn't just the letters. People she trusted, people who knew too much, began to vanish like smoke through cracked doors. One by one, their names stopped appearing in news feeds, their phones stopped ringing. A junior journalist who once joked about her Vatican secrets was found drowned in a river she had no reason to cross. A friend who had driven her home from the airport disappeared without explanation. His apartment left untouched, the coffee still warm on the counter. By the third letter, Jasmine no longer slept through the night. By the fifth, she stopped believing in coincidences, and by the seventh, she understood with terrifying clarity. Whatever hunted her now would not be satisfied with silence forever. She had carried the silence like a second skin, worn it until it bled into her bones. But sitting here now, under the suffocating blaze of studio lights, with the entire world watching, Jasmine Crockett knew some silences were meant to be broken, even if it cost everything. The chair beneath her felt harder than steel, the air thicker, almost syrupy in her lungs as she slid her hand slowly inside her jacket. The MC was still talking, nervous, bright, desperate, but his voice had become little more than a mosquito buzz at the edge of her hearing. Her fingers closed around the familiar weight buried deep inside the folds of cloth, and her pulse spiked so hard she could feel it echo in her teeth. The envelope was warm now, worn soft by years of friction against her life. The red wax seal cracked at one edge, but still holding like a dam refusing to break. She pulled it free with a deliberate, almost reverent slowness, placing it onto the polished oak table between them as if laying down a weapon. For a moment the MC froze mid-sentence, blinking at the sudden intrusion of something unscripted, something too real for the soft, plastic world of late-night television. The cameras, trained and hungry, pushed forward mechanically, zooming in until the battered envelope nearly filled the nation's screens. The audience shifted, a ripple of bodies pulled by a tide they couldn't see, but could already feel pulling at their ribs. Jasmine lifted her head, her dark eyes locking not on the man across from her, but directly into the cold lens of the main camera, the portal between her and millions. Her voice broke the silence like a match dropped into dry brush. "If not now, then it will never happen." The words didn't echo. They detonated, quiet but final, severing the night neatly in two. Jasmine's hand moved to the wax seal. Her thumb pressed against the brittle surface, and the crack that echoed across the set was so sharp, so absolute, that a few members of the audience physically flinched. She peeled the flap back with the steady care of someone disarming a bomb. Each movement slow, precise, irreversible. The paper inside was stiff, yellowed, trembling faintly under her touch, not from the drafty studio air, but from the charge built up around it. From the years of fear, the years of silence, the years of unseen hands fighting to keep it buried. The MC sat rigid now, his hands clenched uselessly around his cards, color draining from his face as if he could feel instinctively that the ground beneath him was no longer safe. And in that moment, as Jasmine unfolded the letter for all the world to see, the artificial world of late-night TV with its polished jokes and hollow applause crumbled into dust around her feet. The first page was stark. No introduction, no preamble, no gentle descent into what was to come. Just a title typed in faded black ink, its weight sinking into Jasmine's chest like a leaden fist. Operative Financial Ties and Asset Misappropriation. Internal church documentation. She blinked once, her throat tightening, but forced herself to keep reading. Below, the heading sprawled rows upon rows of names, names she recognized, names the world revered. Cardinals, bishops, administrators, all neatly listed beside account numbers, offshore companies, coded transactions stretching from Zurich to the Cayman Islands. The audience watching from behind the invisible wall of broadcast screens couldn't see the details yet, but they could feel it. The crackling energy of revelation ripping the sterile air apart. Jasmine turned the page with a hand that no longer trembled, her movements slow, methodical, as if each word needed to be carved into the bones of everyone watching. The next page drilled deeper, specific properties tied to phantom charities, luxury villas registered under paper organizations, entire hospital networks siphoning funds meant for the sick into anonymous holding companies. Jasmine's eyes scanned the documents, and with every line, the enormity of the betrayal gnawed deeper into her. These weren't just isolated scandals. This was a machine, a network hidden inside the very structure sworn to protect faith, hollowing it out from the inside like rot behind gilded walls. Every transaction was precise, calculated, protected by the armor of ritual and reputation, and every name carried the unbearable weight of trust broken beyond repair. There were no denials here, no gray areas left to argue over, only numbers, only signatures, only the slow bleeding out of a sacred institution into the cold, hungry hands of those who had long since abandoned their souls for ledgers. Jasmine could hear the tension now palpable even through the studio's soundproofed walls, the sharp inhalations of the audience, the shifting of bodies, too stunned to pretend this was just entertainment anymore. The MC sat frozen, his hands limp in his lap, eyes darting helplessly to the producers offstage, who themselves sat paralyzed, knowing there was no way to cut to commercial without revealing what they had allowed to be unleashed live. Jasmine pressed forward, flipping to the next page, revealing not just financial decay, but the political web protecting it. Memos, internal Vatican communications, personal correspondences coded with euphemisms. So thin they barely disguised the transactions underneath. Deals brokered with governments, silence purchased from media outlets, promotions awarded in exchange for loyalty to a system rotting under its own weight. And then she found it, the page that stopped even her breath cold, typed at the bottom of a classified memo in a different, almost hurried hand, was a single line. It was not a transaction. It was not an accusation. It was a prophecy. The destroyer will not come bearing weapons, it read. They will come as a friend clothed in light, but carrying the void. Jasmine stared at the words, feeling the cold knot of understanding tighten in her stomach. This had never been about a single scandal, a single betrayal. This had been foretold, anticipated, feared. Somewhere within the marble corridors and golden halls they had known that the death of faith wouldn't come through violence. It would come through seduction, through imitation, through those who smiled and prayed and shook hands, all the while emptying the soul of everything it was meant to protect. She raised her head slowly, the paper trembling faintly in her grip now, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the truth she held. Across the table, the MC was pale, sweat glistening at his temples despite the cold of the studio. Behind the cameras, a low, involuntary murmur rippled through the crew. Somewhere in the darkness of the audience, someone gasped audibly, unable to contain it any longer. Jasmine turned another page, revealing photographs stapled to the final section of the letter. Grainy images of villas bought with stolen donations, yachts registered under ghost charities, luxury cars gifted in the names of the poor. Attached to each image was a name, a title, a date, enough evidence to ignite a fire that even the highest walls of the Vatican could not smother. And still the last sheet of the letter remained. It was different from the others. Handwritten, hurried, the ink smudged in places as if penned under unbearable pressure. "If you are reading this," it began, "then I am gone." Jasmine's throat locked, her fingers curling tighter around the edges of the fragile paper. There are those who will tell you that to expose this truth is to destroy faith. They are wrong. Faith cannot be destroyed by the truth. It can only be destroyed by lies defended in silence. Each word cut deeper than the last, stripping away any lingering doubt, any last temptation to hide this nightmare back inside the darkness where it had been born. "Do not protect the walls," it ended. "Protect what the walls were built to shelter. Protect the flame, even if the temple burns." Jasmine lowered the letter slowly, her hands steady now, the audience dead silent, the world holding its breath. Jasmine let the last page of the letter settle onto the table, its weight filling the studio like a slow-rising tide. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence thicken, let the audience feel the full gravity of what they had just witnessed. Then, with hands steady but eyes dark with a grief too old to name, she reached inside her jacket once more. From a slim in her pocket she withdrew a single photograph, its corners bent and worn, its surface scuffed by countless nights of being handled and hidden and re-examined under trembling hands. The camera zoomed instinctively, as if sensing something unspeakable was about to cross the line between the unseen and the unforgettable. Jasmine placed the photograph face down on the table for a moment, her fingers lingering atop it as if weighing whether to flip it, whether to cross a second threshold from which there would be no return. Her voice, when it finally broke the stillness, was low, almost reverent. "There's something else," she said, something that never made sense until now. She turned the photograph over with a soft, deliberate movement, revealing the image to the world. Under the dim, grainy resolution of a nighttime shot, two figures could be seen walking side by side, Jasmine and Pope Francis, unmistakable despite the blurring fog of the lens. They were alone, or so they had believed. The olive trees arched above them like cathedral rafters, the moonlight barely enough to sketch their outlines against the heavy dark. But in the far corner of the frame, almost swallowed by the shadows, lurked a third shape. A figure half-shrouded in a long hooded cloak, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching. The audience audibly shifted, the collective sound of 1,000 heartbeats catching at once. The MC face drained of color. Even the studio light seemed to flicker, as if recoiling from the ghost now made visible on the screen. This, Jasmine said, tapping the photo lightly with one fingertip, was taken that night in the Vatican Gardens. The night Pope Francis entrusted me with the envelope. Her hand trembled once, just once, but she pressed on. I didn't know this photo even existed until it arrived anonymously in my mailbox a year later. No note, no sender, just this. She paused, letting the image burn itself into every mind watching. Then she said the words that chilled even the cameras to stillness, and that wasn't the last time. She pulled a thin folder from under the table, a folder she had hidden there before the show began. Unsure whether she would have the strength to reveal it, she laid it flat, flipping it open to reveal 3 more photographs, each one a different place, a different year. A political rally in Brussels, a conference hall in New York, a humanitarian summit in Nairobi. In each image, Jasmine stood at the center, surrounded by crowds, by light, by movement. And yet, in the distant, blurred edges of each frame, the same figure, the same hooded shadow watching. You see, Jasmine said, her voice gaining a hard edge now. He didn't just warn me about corruption. He warned me about this. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the storm she had unleashed. Pope Francis once told me, standing under those olive trees, her voice dropped into a near whisper, but the microphone caught every word, broadcasting it into millions of living rooms, echoing across the silence of a world holding its breath. You will see the shadow before you see the light. The words seemed to vibrate against the studio walls, sink into the foundations, reverberate into every bone of every person watching. For a long, agonizing moment no one moved. The photograph of the hooded figure stared back at them all, silent, immutable, real. Jasmine leaned back slightly in her chair, her body rigid, her face carved in something that was not quite fear, but not yet triumph either. They've been following me for years, she said, simply, waiting, watching, making sure this moment never happened. And now, with the letter opened and the photographs laid bare, the silence that had once been her prison had become her weapon. The truth was no longer something hidden in dark gardens and sealed envelopes. It was alive. It had a face, and it had just been unleashed upon the world. The photographs lay like shattered mirrors across the table, and for a moment the world seemed suspended, holding its breath, trapped between everything it had believed and everything it could no longer deny. Jasmine Crockett understood that this was not the end of a revelation. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Jasmine rose from her chair with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands sliding away from the evidence spread before her as if shedding a final chain. The studio lights caught the edge of her silhouette, framing her like a statue carved in the moment before battle. Every eye in the room followed her wide and unblinking, as if afraid that even a blink might cause this fragile, terrible moment to vanish. The MC sat paralyzed, still clutching his useless cue cards, sweat glistening on his forehead, as if he too was a man who had realized too late that the rules of the game had changed and that the old scripts would no longer save anyone. Jasmine stepped forward, the polished stage floor creaking faintly under her heels, every movement radiating in intensity so fierce that it seemed to scorch the very air around her. She stopped just shy of the front of the stage, turned to face the audience, and beyond them, the millions now glued to screens across the world. Her eyes burned, not with rage, but with a clarity so sharp it felt almost violent. "Faith is not dead," she said, and her voice rang out, not like a plea, but like a verdict carved into stone. "It has been buried." The words sliced through the stunned silence, leaving behind an aching space too wide for applause, too deep for denial. Jasmine stood tall, the edges of her presence cutting through the manufactured comfort of the studio like a blade through silk. Around her, the cameras continued to roll, silent witnesses to a history no one had planned to air, but now no one could escape. In silence, she continued, her voice low but unbreakable, "is not surrender." She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle into every corner of room, into every spine sitting rigid under the pressure of realization. "Silence," she said, her gaze sweeping across them all like a floodlight scouring a battlefield, "is the battleground of those who still carry the light." The studio shuddered under the force of her words, as if the very walls had absorbed the truth and found themselves wanting. Jasmine took another step forward, the letter and photographs abandoned behind her like ashes of a world too corrupt to salvage. The MC shifted helplessly in his chair, the muscles of his jaw working soundlessly, his carefully managed world crumbling into pieces he could no longer fit back together. The audience remained frozen, not because they were indifferent, but because they knew deep in the marrow of their bones that something irreversible had been set into motion. Jasmine's eyes flickered once more toward the camera, the great unblinking eye that now carried her words into living rooms, into phones, into the hearts of those who had stopped believing that anything could truly change. She straightened her shoulders one final time, the fire in her gaze growing brighter, hotter, refusing to be extinguished. "The truth," she said, voice dropping into a near whisper that somehow felt louder than any shout, "is quieter than lies." The words settled like iron into the collective chest of the audience, heavy and permanent. But one day Jasmine paused, her eyes flashing, daring the world to keep listening. Who it will roar louder than them all. For a heartbeat longer, she stood there, a single figure against a backdrop too small to contain her. Then, with a final deliberate motion, Jasmine turned. She walked off the stage, not rushed, not fleeing, but with the slow, unbreakable gait of someone carrying a torch through a city already crumbling under the weight of its own betrayal. No music played, no applause rose, only the deep, stunned silence of a world realizing it had just been changed. Whether it was ready or not, the letter, the photographs, the silent warnings, they remained behind her, abandoned on the table, like remnants of a war that was only just beginning. But Jasmine Crockett no longer needed them. She had already become the message, and in the heart of that silence, for the first time in too long, truth began to breathe. The echo of Jasmine's final words still hung in the studio air long after she disappeared backstage, a lingering tremor that no commercial break or scripted closing monologue could erase. For a heartbeat, the entire room, audience, crew, host sat frozen in a stunned paralysis, caught between the fading pulse of the show's usual illusion and the raw violence of what had just been laid bare. The cameras continued to roll for several seconds longer, capturing blank stares, half-open mouths, cards fluttering to the ground like defeated flags. Then someone offstage cut the feed, not with a dramatic closing, but a desperate yank of the power cable, plunging millions of homes into sudden, jarring silence. But it was already too late. The fire had started. Within minutes, the footage of Jasmine unfolding the Vatican letter, of the sealed documents and grainy photographs spread across the polished oak table, flooded every corner of the internet. Someone had recorded the live feed on a phone, someone had uploaded it, and now it spread like wildfire, no force on earth fast enough to cage it back. On Twitter, hashtags ignited with the fury of 1,000 storms. Cheer, silent, no more. Chose the letter, cheetah, the shadow, and the light within an hour. The silent Truth was trending in 23 countries. Major news outlets scrambled to catch up, their polished anchors hurriedly discarding the evening's original scripts in favor of frantic live coverage. CNN broke into its prime-time broadcast with a flashing red breaking news banner. The familiar voices now uncertain, almost trembling as they tried to summarize what they had just witnessed. BBC aired a full replay of the segment within 45 minutes, cutting their previously scheduled royal family special without apology. Reuters, Associated Press, and Al Jazeera unleashed teams of analysts and investigators pouring through every frame of the leaked footage, dissecting Jasmine's words line by line in living rooms, airports, college dormitories, bars, and church halls around the world. People stopped whatever they were doing to watch, rewatch, and argue over what it meant. Some saw betrayal, some saw salvation, but no one, absolutely no one, could look away. In the first 3 hours, responses from the church hierarchy began to trickle out. Statements hastily drafted, cold and impersonal, aimed more at quelling panic than at offering any real answers. These accusations are unfounded. The Church remains committed to transparency and truth. Documents obtained outside of authorized channels cannot be verified, but the words felt hollow, brittle, breaking apart under the sheer gravity of what Jasmine had exposed. For every official denial, a new voice rose up online. Former seminary students, disillusioned parishioners, journalists long blacklisted by Vatican officials. One by one, they began sharing their own fragments of the story, photographs, invoices, letters, hints that they too had seen cracks in the marble long before tonight. The dam was breaking, and there would be no way to patch it now. By midnight, spontaneous gatherings formed across major cities. In New York's Union Square, hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder, many holding candles, some holding signs that simply read, "Faith survives truth." In Paris, a silent march wound its way along Seine, the only sound the soft ripple of banners in the cold night air. In Rome itself, barely a mile from the Vatican walls, crowds gathered at Piazza San Pietro, their faces illuminated by the soft, unwavering glow of phone screens, replaying Jasmine's broadcast again and again. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't a protest. It was something quieter and therefore infinitely more dangerous. It was the moment when silence stopped meaning obedience. Inside the Vatican, the reaction was swift and panicked. An emergency meeting of the College of Cardinals was convened behind locked doors. Security forces doubled around St. Peter's Square, their dark silhouettes sharp against the ancient marble, radios crackling with coded instructions. Leaks from within the Vatican began slipping almost immediately, whispers of old alliances fracturing, of young clerics refusing to toe the line, of secret investigations quietly reopened after years of forced dormancy. At one point, just before dawn, an unconfirmed internal memo surfaced, posted anonymously to encrypted forums, spread like a virus among journalists. It reads simply, "The house divided cannot stand." The light is breaking through. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat alone in a rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the glare of television cameras or the roar of crowds. The television in the corner of the room blinked with endless coverage, panels of experts shouting over one another, clumsy headlines flashing across the bottom of the screen. The footage of her standing under the studio lights reading the Vatican letter played on a loop punctuated by endless slow-motion close-ups, her hand cracking the wax seal, her voice cutting through the breathless silence, her face unreadable yet burning with something that no editing could ever erase. She didn't watch the TV. Instead, Jasmine sat by the window, the battered folder resting on her lap, her fingers tracing the folds and creases worn into it by years of fear. In the distance over the city skyline, the first great streaks of dawn clawed at the horizon. She knew the fire had been lit. She knew it would rage beyond her control now, and she knew the next battle would not be fought on a talk show stage. It would be fought in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in the shadowed corridors of power, where the true architects of silence would now turn their full attention to stopping her, but it didn't matter anymore. She had done what needed to be done. For the first time in years, Jasmine Crockett allowed herself to close her eyes, not in defeat, but in a hard, battered kind of peace. The truth was out, and it would either save them or burn them all to the ground. The marble corridors of the apostolic palace had always been cold, but tonight they seemed to hum with something colder, still fear. Beneath the gilded ceilings and endless mosaics, the true heart of Vatican power was convulsing. Word of Jasmine Crockett's broadcast had spread faster than even the oldest among them thought possible, shattering the careful scaffolding of silence built over decades. In the papal apartments, the glow of television screens cast harsh reflections onto ancient portraits, their painted saints staring blindly down at a new reality they could neither bless nor avert. A conclave was summoned in the dead of night, not the sacred ceremonial kind, but something far more urgent and ruthless. Cardinals in crimson robes moved quickly down the hidden hallways, their whispers sharp as knives. By the time the emergency council convened, the tension was so thick it seemed almost physical, clinging to the air like smoke after a battlefield candidate. Rows of grim-faced officials filed into the great hall, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old tapestries, now dulled with dust and secrecy. Security was doubled. Swiss guards in full regalia flanking every entrance, their halyards ceremonial in appearance but deadly in training. The Cardinal Secretary of State stood at the head of the long table, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the polished wood. No prayers were offered to begin the session. There were no benedictions, only the low murmur of a world collapsing under its own lies. They knew what was coming, and for the first time in living memory, they did not know how to stop it. The first order of business was containment. Within hours, carefully crafted statements were dispatched to every major media outlet across the globe. The Church categorically denies the authenticity of the documents presented. No credible evidence supports the allegations made. The Holy See remains committed to transparency, accountability, and service to the faithful. But the language felt hollow even as it was spoken. It was the language of institutions too large to imagine their own death, desperately applying old bandages to wounds now gushing far beyond their control. Inside the room, arguments flared. One faction, mostly younger reformist clerics, urged transparency, real investigations, a reckoning long overdue. If we do not act, one brave man senior said, voice trembling, they will tear it down for us. But his words were met with glares sharpened by decades of palace intrigue. The older faction, the Carreras, the architects of silence, had no intention of surrendering the citadel they had spent their lives fortifying. We survived Luther, one cardinal snapped. We will survive a political actress on a talk show. The room buzzed with uneasy agreement, but deep down, even the most cynical among them felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Because this time it was different. This time there were receipts. By dawn, internal directives were issued to every diocese, monastery, and affiliated institution worldwide. Discredit the source, question the validity of the documents, frame the event as an attack on faith itself, invoke history. Persecution, martyrdom, righteous endurance. Within 12 hours, carefully selected voices, bishops, theologians, media allies began appearing on news channels, radio programs, op-ed pages. They spoke not of the evidence itself, but of Jasmine's character, her supposed political motivations, dangers of weaponized misinformation. A cardinal with decades of media experience delivered a solemn televised address, invoking the memory of saints who had suffered for truth, twisting the narrative into one of victimhood for the institution rather than for the people it had betrayed. But even as the machine roared into motion, cracks appeared. Behind closed doors, Vatican financial officers frantically pored over archives, shredding documents, routing accounts, severing digital trails that might link offshore holdings to high offices. At least 2 mid-level administrators disappeared. Entirely, their offices found empty, personal effects hastily abandoned. And worse, whispers began circulating among the lower clergy, among seminarians, among the lay. Whispers that the documents were not only real but incomplete, that there was more, much more, and Jasmine had only shown the first knife. Outside Vatican walls, the world seethed. Investigative reporters swarmed the city like vultures, some flashing press credentials, others bribing janitors and gatekeepers for scraps of access. Rumors of resignations filled the cafes along Via della Caniglia, blending with the thick scent of espresso and quiet dread. Crowds still gathered in St. Peter's Square, larger now, angrier, bolder, holding candles, holding signs, holding their breath. A homemade banner was hoisted into the air one afternoon by a group of university students. We believed in the light. You worshipped the walls. The Vatican's official radio station tried to downplay the unrest, broadcasting endless streams of choral music, prayers for unity, homilies on forgiveness. But no hymn could drown out the growing roar outside, because this time the betrayal wasn't hidden behind theological jargon or legal obfuscation. It was printed in black and white. It had faces, it had names, and the faithful could read. Inside the apostolic palace, the old men gathered again as dusk fell, their faces more haggarded now, their prayers tighter, tinged with something dangerously close to panic. We must reclaim the narrative, the Cardinal Secretary of State said, pounding the table with a fist that trembled slightly. If we do not, we are lost. Proposals filled the air like desperate arrows. Stage a symbolic firing of a few expendable officials. Announce a grand council of reform months into the future. Enough to buy time, not so soon as to require action. Redirect attention, highlight missions of mercy, charitable projects, global peace initiatives. But nothing, not the blood of martyrs, not the gold of centuries, could put the genie back into the bottle, because now every word they spoke sounded exactly like what it was, the frantic noise of men who knew the walls were crumbling and the light was coming in whether they liked it or not. And in a small forgotten side chapel of the Vatican, where ancient candles flickered against crumbling fresco, a lone priest knelt long into the night. He was not part of the council. He was not part of the cover-up. He was just a man who had once believed the marbling gold could hold back the darkness. Tears streaked his face as he whispered a prayer, not for the institution but for the souls betrayed inside it. Forgive us, he said to the silence. Forgive us for forgetting what the light was meant to protect. And above him the candle light danced wildly across the faded inscription carved centuries earlier into the stone, Veritas vos liberabit, the truth shall set you free, and somewhere far beyond those heavy walls Jasmine Crockett watched and waited and prepared for what would come next, because the Vatican had made its move, and now it was her turn. The night was deeper than black when Jasmine finally turned off the television. The apartment where she had been hiding for the past 2 days sat, perched on the edge of the city, surrounded by nothing but the whisper of empty streets and the cold blinking of distant radio towers. The room was dim, lit only by a single battered lamp in the corner and the steady blue pulse of her laptop in sleep mode. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, distant but constant, as if the entire world was on the verge of waking from a nightmare or plunging deeper into it. Jasmine leaned back in the creaking armchair, the battered folder lying open on her knees, the Vatican letter, the photographs, the evidence no amount of denial could erase. Her phone vibrated again against the tabletop, the screen lighting up with yet another unknown number. She didn't answer. She hadn't answered the last 20 calls either, because Jasmine already knew what they wanted. Some offered her sanctuary, discreet, hidden, quiet. Some offered her money, millions, to disappear, to never speak again, and some didn't offer at all. They simply warned, leave now before it's too late. The warnings came dressed as advice, but Jasmine could feel the chill beneath them, the same chill she had felt the night Pope Francis handed her the sealed envelope beneath the olive trees. The wolves had found her scent again, and this time they wouldn't just watch. A soft knock rattled the apartment door, not loud, not urgent, just persistent. Jasmine froze, every muscle tensing under her skin like coiled wire. Slowly she rose to her feet, crossing the worn carpet in bare, silent steps. She didn't speak. She didn't ask who was there. Instead, she checked the security camera feed from her phone, installed by a friend who had insisted after the broadcast. Two men stood outside the door. Black jackets, neutral expressions, no badges, no visible weapons. But everything about their posture screamed practiced violence. They weren't here to arrest her. They were here to offer a choice or deliver an ultimatum. Jasmine backed away from the door without a sound, heart hammering against her ribs. They knocked again, softer this time, almost polite. Then silence, long, stretching silence, and then the sound of retreating footsteps, but Jasmine knew better than to think they had truly left. She spent the next hour pacing the apartment, mind racing. Her options were brutally simple: disappear or fight. She could take the escape route offered, the hidden compound in South America, the new identity, the erased past. She could vanish into the fog of history, a martyr whispered about but forgotten when the next scandal drowned the world's attention, or she could stay. She could stand her ground. She could carry the truth until it crushed her, or until it burned a hole through the darkness wide enough for others to follow. But staying meant war. Staying meant living every second, knowing the wolves would circle tighter, closer, more desperate. With every breath, it meant sacrifice. It meant betrayal. It meant becoming something more than just the woman who opened a letter. It meant becoming a symbol, and symbols bled more than soldiers. Jasmine closed her eyes, the weight of it pressing down on her so hard she thought her knees might buckle. She thought of Pope Francis standing alone under the olive trees, his eyes hollow with the knowledge of the battle he could not win alone. She thought of the faces of the audience as she revealed the truth, some stunned, some furious, some weeping without even knowing why. She thought of the children who would grow up either believing the truth was worth fighting for, or believing silence was the price of survival. And finally, she thought of the shadow, the hooded figure in every photograph, the warning that had haunted her steps for years. You will see the shadow before you see the light. He had not lied. The shadows were here, but maybe, just maybe, so was the light. Dawn began to creep over the skyline. Bleeding cold gray light into the corners of the apartment, Jasmine moved to the table where the battered folder lay open. She gathered the documents with careful, steady hands, fitting them back into their protective sleeves. She tucked the photographs into an inner pocket of her coat. The images of the hooded figure, the evidence that could no longer be denied. Then she opened her laptop and began to type. Not a resignation letter, not a farewell, a manifesto, a declaration. She would not hide. She would not be silent. And she would not let them convince the world that silence was the same thing as peace. The words poured out of her faster than she could contain them, each sentence sharp, edged, and electric. Faith is not built on marble. It is not protected by silence. It does not survive behind locked doors or in hidden vaults. Faith survives by the courage of those who refuse to bow before the golden idols of power and fear. This is not an attack on the church. It is a call back to its soul, and if speaking the truth means walking into the shadow, then so be it. I would rather stand alone in the light than kneel forever in darkness. When she finished, she hit save and then sent the document to a carefully curated list of journalists, activists, and clergy she knew she could trust. It would be published with or without her. The sun had fully risen now, flooding the apartment with a pale, unforgiving light. Jasmine zipped her coat, slinging the old battered folder under her arm. She moved to the door, hand resting on the handle for a moment longer than necessary. On the other side of that door the battle waited, the men in black jackets, the silent watchers, the agents of fear. But fear, she realized now, was a choice too, and she had already chosen. With a steady breath, Jasmine Crockett opened the door and stepped into the war she had been born to fight. Not as a victim, not as a fugitive, but as the bearer of a light they could not extinguish. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story.